All right, you're thinking about making a couple of changes to your diet, and you've been hearing about protein, increasing protein in your diet, not eating enough protein, and you're just confused about where to go with what's the right amount of protein for you. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I'm going to walk you through today not only where to get your protein from, but we're also going to talk about what's an ideal amount of protein for you to be consuming, and I'm going to show you some evidence to guide these recommendations. Now, this is a common observation that I have in clinical practice where individuals are confused about the amount of protein that they should be consuming. And in most cases, the outcome of that is that individuals are not consuming enough protein. So typically, when we don't know which direction to go, we just don't take action. And when it comes to not consuming protein in the diet, that can have some implications. Now, one of the things that we can often see with low protein intake is that there are going to be a couple of lab markers that I often view that are going to be out of range that can begin to point us that this is really probably the underlying cause of why some symptoms are starting to arise and some connections that we can make. And fortunately, when we can make some easy dietary recommendations, that can start to offer some quick solutions for most individuals. Now, what are things that we'd see? Well, for example, if you're familiar with looking at markers like blood urea nitrogen, abbreviated BUN, or creatinine, these are two very common markers that we can quickly begin to look at to get an idea that someone maybe is not consuming enough protein in their diet. We can also look at indicators with phosphorus. Phosphorus may tell us that the phosphorus-rich foods are lacking in the diet or that those foods aren't being broken down adequately. And so that could be another variable that we have to consider, is that maybe you consume protein, but maybe you're not breaking that protein down. And then the last one that comes to mind tends to be a bit more straightforward, which is going to be total protein, which we can further break down into albumin and globulin to give us an idea of what our blood proteins are, and then also the immune system related proteins. Now, there's other indicators that we can look at indirectly. For example, if we see problems with blood sugar, that may give us some insight that there is not an adequate balance of what we refer to as the macronutrients coming into the diet. There may be too much glucose relative to the amount of protein or fats that are being ingested. So these are all things that we can look at from a lab standpoint. But the bottom line, and really the topic for our conversation today, is looking at what's an adequate amount of protein, especially since a lot of individuals will underconsume protein. So what I want to do as a starting point for us is I want to share with you some information out of the medical literature, just some quick talking points that will help guide this conversation along, and that will give some credit to the statements that I'm going to be making with you. So first of all, I want to share with you the overall dietary protein intake in humans and give an idea of where we should be thinking as far as how much we're consuming. And you can see here we've out of the Journal of Food and Function. I'll summarize this and I'll break this down a little bit more as we go forward. But what you see here is that this particular study is showing that there's a relatively broad range of protein intake that an individual can have. And that balance can be based on activity level. It can be based on other metabolic needs. It can be based on stress. There's a lot of variables that can come into that number. So the point here is that your protein intake shouldn't be thought of as a static number. That number can be fluctuating. It can be moving based on metabolic need. But at a very minimum, unless someone has chronic renal disease or chronic kidney disease, which I will speak more to that in a moment. So let's don't run too far with that just yet. But at a minimum, most individuals should be taking in about 0.8 grams per kilogram. And so if we look at the scale on that, that is the bare minimum that is going to be considered ideal. So just take your body weight in pounds, convert that into kilograms, and then multiply that number by 0.8, and that'll give you an idea of how much you should be consuming on a routine day. Now, that number that 0.8 grams, again, the minimum, can go up and should go up as our activity level increases. Now, if we look at our activity and we think, all right, what's our metabolic need here? Well, for someone who is up moving around more, maybe has more of an active job, just as an example on this, that's an individual who's going to be around about 1 gram per kilogram. If the activity level increases above that, you have a moderate activity, so someone who's potentially exercising at a low to moderate level 3, maybe even 4 times a week, we get up to 1.3 grams per kilogram. And then if it's an individual, let's say, for example, a competitive athlete, and a competitive athlete may mean that they actually compete in competitions, or it may mean that they're just inherently competitive against themselves, trying to better themselves. That individual is going to be better suited about 1.6 grams per kilogram to meet their metabolic needs. So they're going to need more. Now, it doesn't mean that it ends there. We can go up above that. So, for example, what would be considered a high protein intake is around 2 grams per kilogram. And so you can see we continue to scale up here. But notice that when we get into a realm of what's considered the upper limit, when are you actually consuming too much protein? Well, frankly, I don't know. I haven't seen clear evidence that there is a true threshold that you just cannot break. However, a number that we tend to look at as an upper limit based in the literature and referencing back to the study I just shared with you was 3.5 grams per kilogram. And just to put that in the context of what that amount is for in pounds, that's 320 grams more or less per or for a 200-pound individual. So you're talking about a very excessive amount of protein, truly more than is needed to optimize function. But I do think for most individuals, especially if you're doing some degree of activity, getting the protein up around 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram is going to be better. And if you just need to, here in the United States, we obviously don't operate with any consistency in kilograms. So if you just need to round this off fairly easily, just look at 1.75 to 2 grams per pound of body weight, and that'll give you an idea of what's considered the higher upper end intake. Now, most of you, I won't say most of you, some of you are going to struggle to get into the realm of even getting in a gram per pound. And so that should be your initial starting point. And the first thing that you should look at as you're increasing that is asking yourself, how do I feel? Did I notice a change in my, whether it's your energy level, whether it's your mental acuity, whether it's your strength, whether it's your endurance, whether it's your motivation and desire to do things, your hormonal activity? These are all things that are influenced by protein. So those are all things that we would expect to be possible feedback mechanisms for us to better understand our protein intake. But these are some general numbers we should be thinking about and some things that we should be looking at here. Now, keep in mind that when we start looking at the functionality in regards to proteins, the reason that proteins are so critical in the diet, and one of the reasons that when we look to establish the diet and try to refine it and customize it per individual, one of the things that we start with is protein. And the reason being on that is that whether we're talking about growth, whether we're talking about rehabilitation, the turnover of bone, the turnover of muscle tissue, if we're talking about forming healthy red blood cells, when we think about hemoglobin and that oxygen carrying component in the blood, these are all protein related aspects. We hear a lot and think a lot about the immune system now. We need good, healthy, competent proteins to optimize the capacity of the immune system and to make the immunoglobulins that are going to support overall immune responses. Satiety. If we're looking at staying satiated and looking at how the food that we're consuming is making us feel, protein is going to have a significant impact on that. And that's not a single mechanism by which it does that. It actually does it through multiple mechanisms. And then even in terms of neurological function, when we look at the different neurochemicals, the neurochemicals are protein based. So for example, things like our dopamine, our serotonin, our GABA, those are all based in proteins, and those are going to govern how we feel day in and day out. Now, I wanted to show you a couple of other things here in regards to the medical literature that are important in helping you select proteins, because now one of the things becomes, all right, you've got these numbers that are helping you understand where a starting point for you should be. So now you've got to take that and you've got to distribute that protein intake out across the day. And when you're doing that, you need to just, as a point of simplicity, just take your 3 meals take your total protein that you've calculated for yourself and just divide that by 3 and make sure that that approximate amount of protein is in your meals per day. So here's what that would look like. Let's say that you calculated out a 90 gram of protein intake is what is ideal for you. So divide that by 3, that's 30. And so you're going to consume 30 grams of protein in each one of your meals, thereabout. An important point to make mention of here is that this does not need to be overly complicated. Your body is not going to count 30 grams of protein down to the half or to the 10th of a gram. It's not going to, it doesn't work that way. There's not that much specificity involved in just trying to a general optimization of your health. Maybe in other aspects, where we start counting grams down to that level of nuance, possibly, but for where most individuals are looking at as a starting point, that's completely unnecessary. We need to be thinking about getting in the ballpark of that 30 grams as I've cited for this particular example. Now, questions come up. Where does that protein need to come from? Well, there's a couple of points of discrepancy out there, and I want to tackle where some of these discrepancies are arising from. And so, first of all, let's just look at, this is from the critical reviews in food, science, and nutrition. And you'll notice on this, what are dietary guidelines in this conversation around meat one, but even red meat beyond that. There almost seems to be this hierarchy of red meats are the most problematic protein source, therefore you should consume those less. Poultry and fowl are going to be less offensive, and then fish less offensive than that, and then plants being the more optimal direction to take. However, what I want to do is I want to show you some evidence to suggest that there's some skewed thinking behind that, and we need to adjust that if we're really looking to try to optimize our health. So notice on this is that with some of the more recent dietary guideline recommendations that there has been this push, even out of organizations and publications such as Lancet, which is a well-known scientific publication. Their recommendations are pushing out that the diet should be mostly plant-based. That's where we should be getting our protein intake. The protein intake should be very low consumption and maybe no consumption from red meat. And if you are going to consume red meat, it shouldn't be more than 14 grams per day. And so the question on this is, does that really match up to what metabolic needs are? And so if you're thinking only 14 grams of red meat consumption, and maybe you're even looking at this and going further and saying only 14 grams of animal-based protein consumption, does that help us meet our metabolic needs? And the answer to that is probably no, it's not going to. In fact, as we look at this and we understand what the implications are from that low consumption of meat, the question you have to ask is, does that actually outweigh what the potential associated risks with that are? And are those risks truly substantiated? And here's the thing that's noted about this, is that as this study lays out, it says that we argue that claims about the health dangers of red meat are not only improbable in the light of our evolutionary history, and so predominantly the foods that we have consumed over our lifetimes and that our ancestors consumed, but they are far from being supported by robust scientific evidence. So the mindset here is that we hear some of these things, but we always need to come back and ask the question, well, is that truly validated? Or is this just a talking point for an individual or an organization to move forward with that's not truly matching up to what your metabolic needs are? And this was the reason that I went back and I started with the laboratory, making mention to the laboratory assessment. So these don't have to be ambiguous recommendations. These can be recommendations that are very concrete in nature, that we have lab data to suggest that, yes, push your intake of protein forward and let's see if it matches an improvement in your symptoms, or let's back that protein intake down a bit, see if we can maintain your symptom improvement and not consume that higher amount of protein if it theoretically it appears that you don't need it, but yet you're still meeting your baseline requirements. And so those are how we try to balance this. Now, there's a couple of other points in this that we need to ask as well. And here's one of the ones that I wanted to show, because the argument in terms of your protein choices And I'm going to lead up to a point here where if you're looking for direction on which way to go with your proteins, I'm going to give you some things to work through to think about of ways to pull your proteins in. But you'll notice on this is that this particular study is looking at it's contrasting animal-based proteins and plant-based proteins. Now, I also want to say, and I'll dive into this topic down the road, but there's a difference in the quality of proteins depending on where that animal is coming from, how that animal has been handled, how those crops have been raised. There's all kind of variables that we have to consider. And while these are almost often lumped into the same conversation, the reality is that they should be differentiated. Now, with that in mind, if we're looking at, just for our ease of conversation today, differentiating between plant proteins and animal proteins, what we want to see is that, notice here is that considering both the quantity and quality, the value of the proteins in animal products for human consumption, right? Human consumption, and this is highlighting milk and beef, is 2.15 times higher than that of proteins in the potentially human edible plant protein inputs. Said differently and more to the point is that you're going to get 2.15 times more benefit and the quality of the protein that you're consuming from an animal source versus a plant source. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. You can delve into the whole conversation around anti-nutrients in many of these plants that are labeled as high protein versus the lack of anti-nutrients in animal foods. We can get into the difference in the amino acids, where there's a more complete array of amino acids in your animal-based foods versus your plant-based foods. And so you can very quickly see that I'm trying to illustrate to you that there needs to be strong consideration for animal-based proteins in your diet based on this level of evidence. Now, let's talk about one other piece to this, which is, well, what about in the aging population? We don't need to consume as much protein as we age. We don't do as much, and we're not as active as we were when we were younger, so we can cut that back. We can lean heavier on the consumption of more plant-related foods, and that just doesn't hold water either. And quite frankly, the reason that it doesn't is based on a term known as sarcopenia. And sarcopenia simply means your skeletal muscle tissue and loss of skeletal muscle tissue more specifically. And therefore, as you lose that skeletal muscle tissue, your functionality declines. This is going to have an impact on your mobility. It's going to have an impact on your strength. You're going to be more fragile. There's going to be an impact on your overall hormones, your sense of well-being. And therefore, if you take all of those factors into consideration and you look at that progressing those in a negative manner, what we ultimately see is that quality of life quickly falls off and declines, as opposed to if we can offset sarcopenia, maintain our mobility, maintain our neurological health as a byproduct of that, that can all be supported by having adequate dietary protein intake. And it's suggested that in individuals that are older, that greater than 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight is what should be consumed. So this puts us back into that individual who would, if we were looking at the chart that I showed you early on, we would be looking at somewhere in that moderate to or low to moderate intensity type of activity. These are going to be the numbers that would match this individual, these older individuals as well. Point being, you need to increase your protein intake or maintain a higher protein intake as you age. Now, there's often these concerns about if you're consuming excess protein, you're going to damage the kidney function. You're going to decrease your bone integrity. Your bones are going to likely become more osteoporotic. And the question I would ask is, are either of these things that you want as you age? And of course they're not. They're things that with osteoporosis, you're more prone to that as you age if you're not taking proactive steps to prevent that. But notice in this is that it's the statement that I find interesting at the end of this particular abstract is that critically, the often cited potential negative effects of consuming higher protein intakes on renal and bone health are without scientific foundation in humans. So again, we listen to all this conjecture out there about these problems related to higher protein intake, and they just don't match up. They're just not laid in they don't have a solid foundation in science. They are just abstract talking points that don't mean anything at the end of the day. And in fact, I can think of several examples of elderly individuals that I work with that when we increase the protein intake in their diet, they inherently start feeling better. They just notice a general sense of well-being. And many times, and you may fall into this camp too, that you've heard that I need to consume more vegetables, more vegetables, more vegetables. And this is not an anti-vegetable conversation, but when they look at, well, I need to consume all those vegetables and then I get full off of the vegetables and then I don't have room to consume the protein, the prioritization on which is more important for that individual is not in alignment with what their needs are. Protein should be the primary consumption, should be the primary food that they're consuming, and then secondarily, the vegetables should make up the rest of the diet to the point of their satiety. Now, all of that being said, let's now talk about where your protein sources should come from and where you're going to get the most benefit at. And the place we're going to start with this, as you will probably guess based on some of the studies that I've selected to present to you here, is going to be with red meat. Now, let me be emphatic about this, is that this needs to be true high-quality red meat. This doesn't need to be a processed red meat. This doesn't need to be a hamburger going through a fast food line. This needs to be high-quality red meat because we know that when we look at for example, some of the information that's out there that lays claims that red meat is problematic, those individuals, those studies are not differentiating between the quality and the sourcing on where that's all coming from. Many times that's just based on simple questionnaire recall, which is inaccurate. Not a lot of great ability to recall. Just ask yourself, how efficiently can you recall the topics that you've talked to someone about and the foods that you've consumed over the last week, and you'll find that's not as easy as you initially think it is. So the way that I would prioritize this in your diet is you need to routinely consume red meat. Now, I'm just giving you generalizations. Everybody's different. Everybody's case specific on this, but as a generalized starting point, adequate consumption of red meat, that is going to be the most nutrient dense forms of meat. You're going to find various proteins in there, combinations of these amino acids that in and of themselves have metabolic activity that are going to be health promoting. So we don't want to miss the opportunity to consume those in the diet. So red meats and ruminant animal source red meat. So what does that look like? Beef. Clearly the easiest one to consume in the diet just because it's the most readily available. Right behind that, lamb and bison are probably the next two that are the easiest to consume. And then you'll find that because there's a lot of hunters out there, myself included, venison is going to find its way onto that list as well. And so these are all in there. And then if you consume goat, that would be another option as well. So right there, you've got 5 red meats, 5 ruminant-based meats that you could consume from. Next to that, we're going to find, or next in line, we're going to find our poultry. And we should be thinking about the two obvious ones at the top of the list. We can consume our chicken and our turkey. Those are going to be the easiest ones to consume. But again, I have to stress to you on this, and please check out other information that I've put out in regards to the differences in production of poultry versus a pasture-based system and a conventional system. They are light years apart. The differences in these food sources is drastically different. And even if you just don't care about the nutritional quality and all you frankly care about is taste, pasture-raised poultry always tastes better. And so that should be an easy point of differentiation for you. And so you got poultry in there. Now, the next category we want to look at, and maybe I should even, and let me just do this. Let me just say I should have put this ahead of the poultry. That's going to be eggs. Whether this is chicken eggs or duck eggs, those are going to be your two most common, but you can also find guinea eggs and quail eggs. You can find goose eggs. These are all suitable options as well and things that you should be looking for, but these are going to be extremely high quality protein. They're going to have in the yolks in those, it's going to have nutrients like choline and the other fat soluble vitamins that are not always the easiest to find in the diet, but they're going to be extremely rich and valuable in terms of your overall health and what they're going to do for you. So you've got your red meats, your ruminant meats, your eggs, you're going to have your poultry, and then if you're not sensitive to it and you're buying quality sources on this, dairy can be an option for you as well. Excellent protein sources, complete protein sources here. If you can find a raw source of dairy or a low heat pasteurized source of dairy, these should be considerations for you as well. But again, this is not a one size fits all recommendation. I fully understand some individuals are going to have problems with dairy. I see it with patients. I get it. I realize that. But where it makes sense for you to consume these and have them in the diet on a rotation to reduce your probability of developing a reaction to these, you should at least consider these. Now, last on that list, I would say would be fish as far as a complete protein source goes. Fish just does not have the same level of density as compared to some of these other sources that I've mentioned for you. Fish isn't bad. Fish can be good, assuming you're getting quality sources and you're sourcing it adequately. But it needs to be prioritized accurately as well. And that you should just have a hierarchy of how you're going to make your food selection. So with this in mind, guys, make sure that you're looking at these numbers of how much protein do I need to hit per day. Start with that. Just focus on initially making sure, regardless of what the source on this is, that you're getting that amount of protein in each day. And then as you continue to consistently consume that amount of protein and you're seeing that your overall health is improving, the next thing that you should do is start to nail down your sourcing on your protein and where that total protein intake is coming from each day using the hierarchy that I gave you of ruminant animals, eggs, dairy, poultry, fish. And use that as your stepwise progression, and you'll see that your health will improve when you're meeting what your body's metabolic requirements are. All right, guys, so with that said, hopefully you'll find that information helpful and useful. Put that information to work for you. If you're looking for more information like this, make sure you come back to the channel and watch more videos. I'll educate you on other topics like this and share personal experience with you of years of working with patients and what has worked for them and what I've seen consistently and observed with them. If you're looking for the quality of meat that I've discussed and alluded to in this video, go to harvesthillsranch.com. We produce the highest quality meats with uncompromising standards, and we do it to meet the criteria that I've suggested in this video, that we want you to get every bit of nutrition out of the food that you're consuming that is absolutely possible to drive your health to the highest and most optimal level. So until next time, guys, we'll see you soon. I'm Dr. Arland Hill.